In a quiet, suburban neighborhood, Susan Adams enjoys the safety and tranquility of her well-ordered life. But when a mysterious man knocks on her door late one evening asking for help, her sense of security is shaken. Torn between fear and compassion, Susan's decision sets off a chain of events that will force her to confront unsettling truths about herself, her assumptions, and the hidden consequences of her actions. As tension builds and the night unfolds, she's faced with the question, what really happens when we let fear guide our choices? Susan Adams sat in her favorite armchair, wrapped in a soft throw blanket, staring at her phone screen. The evening had been uneventful, as most evenings were in the comfortable, well-maintained suburb where she had lived for the past 20 years. Her neighborhood had a reputation for being safe, one of those quiet, upper-middle-class enclaves, just far enough from the city to feel like an escape from the growing chaos she saw in the news every day. Her husband, Michael, had passed away 3 years earlier, and now the house felt too big. It was her sanctuary, but it was also lonely. Susan had filled her days with book clubs, volunteer work, and social gatherings with her neighbors. But in these moments of solitude, the loneliness crept back. She rarely left her home at night, preferring to stay indoors, avoiding the kind of trouble she imagined might exist in the shadows just beyond her yard. Tonight, though, something lingered in the air, a heaviness that Susan couldn't shake. She flicked through the news on her phone, headlines about protests, rising crime rates, and racial tensions appearing in an endless stream. She sighed deeply, setting the phone down. It was all so overwhelming, so far away, yet somehow it felt like it was creeping closer to her world. The TV played softly in the background, the nightly news recounting another day of unrest in the city about 30 miles away. Susan remembered the days when she and Michael would occasionally go downtown for a nice dinner or a play, but that felt like a lifetime ago. She rarely went into the city anymore, convinced by a steady stream of news and conversations with friends that it had become dangerous. She sipped her tea, glancing at the time. 9 p.m. Too late for visitors. She leaned back in her chair, trying to lose herself in a book, but her mind kept wandering back to the state of the world, to the constant reminder that things were changing in ways she couldn't control. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Knock! Knock! Susan's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. Her friends would have called ahead if they planned to stop by. Another knock echoed through the house, louder this time. Knock, knock. Her breath caught in her throat. The unease that had been sitting in her chest all day flared into something stronger, fear. She stood up slowly, her mind racing. Who could it be at this hour? The neighborhood was quiet, and most people had already retreated into their homes for the night. A third knock, insistent now, sent a shiver down her spine. Susan crept toward the door and peeked through the side window. Standing on her porch was a man, a tall figure dressed in a dark hoodie, his head lowered slightly. He shifted on his feet, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Her stomach churned. Her first instinct was to back away, to pretend she wasn't home. But the man knocked again. Ma'am! For a moment, she considered calling the police right away. The fear that had been slowly building in her heart suddenly felt justified. In recent weeks, stories about break-ins and home invasions had been circulating on the neighborhood Facebook page. She recalled her next-door neighbor, Claire, mentioning something about being careful, about not trusting anyone you don't know. Claire had told her a story about a break-in 2 towns over, where a man had posed as someone in need, then forced his way inside. Susan hesitated, glancing again at the man through the window. He was standing just under the porch light now, his face partially visible. He looked young, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, and though his posture was tense, he didn't appear threatening, at least not overtly. But still, the warnings from the news, the stories from her friends, the pervasive feeling of unease, it all clouded her judgment. She took a deep breath and cracked the door open, keeping the chain latched. Yes? She asked, her voice tighter than she intended. The man looked up, and his eyes met hers. They were wide, filled with what seemed like desperation. Ma'am, I'm sorry to bother you, he began, his voice trembling slightly. My car broke down a few blocks away, and my phone's dead. I just need to use a phone to call a tow truck or something. Susan's eyes flickered to his hands, still in his pockets. Her heart raced. She wanted to believe him, wanted to help, but every instinct told her to be cautious. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, cutting him off. "I can't help you." The man's face fell, and for a moment he looked like he might say more. But instead he took a step back, nodding slowly. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice laced with disappointment. "Thank you anyway." He turned and walked down the driveway, disappearing into the shadows. Susan closed the door quickly, locking it behind her. She leaned against the wood, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she just done? The quiet returned, but Susan's mind was racing. She replayed the interaction over and over, trying to make sense of her reaction. He hadn't seemed dangerous, just desperate. But something about the situation had triggered a deep fear inside her, one that she couldn't quite name. She walked back to the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Maybe she should have helped him. Maybe he really was just stranded, and now he was out there, wandering the dark streets, looking for help that might never come. But what if she had opened the door fully? What if she had let him inside, and it turned out to be a trap? She'd heard those stories before, people pretending to be in need only to turn violent once they gained entry. Susan stared at her phone. Should she call someone? Her neighbor Claire, perhaps? Claire would know what to do, or maybe she should call the police just in case. If the man was still wandering around, it might not be safe for anyone. She scrolled through her contacts and hovered over Claire's name. They'd been neighbors for years, and Claire had always been the more cautious one. She was the type to install extra security cameras and keep her doors double locked, even during the day. In fact, Susan often felt embarrassed by her friend's paranoia, but tonight it didn't seem so far-fetched. Susan's finger hovered over the call button. No, she thought, closing the app. She was overreacting. The man had left, and there was no reason to stir up unnecessary fear. Yet despite this rationalization, a gnawing sense of guilt began to take root. She had just turned away someone who might have been in real need. Her phone buzzed suddenly, making her jump. She glanced down at the screen, an incoming call from her daughter, Emma. Susan hesitated for a second before answering. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, trying to sound calm. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice full of concern. "I'm fine. Why do you ask?" I don't know. I had a weird feeling," Emma said, her tone softening. "Are you sure everything's all right? You sound off." Susan smiled slightly at her daughter's intuition. Emma had always been the perceptive one, able to sense when something was wrong even from miles away. She was living in another state now, married with her own family, but they still spoke every few days. "I'm all right," Susan reassured her. "Just had a bit of a scare, that's all." "What happened?" "Some man knocked on the door, asking for help," Susan explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Said his car broke down nearby, but I didn't open the door. I told him I couldn't help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Do you think he was telling the truth?" "I don't know," Susan admitted. "He might have been, but you hear so many stories these days. I just didn't want to take the risk." Emma was silent for a moment, then she sighed. "I get it, Mom. You've got to be careful. But it's hard, you know? You don't want to assume the worst about people." "I know," Susan said, guilt washing over her again. I didn't feel safe." "You did what you thought was best," Emma said gently. "But maybe you could call the police and let them know, just in case he really does need help." Susan nodded, though her daughter couldn't see her. "Yeah, maybe I'll do that." They spoke for a few more minutes, but after they hung up, Susan felt even more unsettled. Emma had always been more open-minded, more willing to see the good in people. Susan, on the other hand, had grown cautious over the years. She'd seen enough news stories and heard enough warnings to know that trusting strangers was risky. She stared out the window, her mind swirling with doubt. What if the man had really needed help? What if she had been his last chance, and now he was out there, still stranded, because she had been too afraid to act? Susan stood up and walked to the door, peeking outside. The street was quiet, the darkness pressing in on the edges of the neighborhood. There was no sign of the man. He was gone. She sighed and returned to her seat, trying to push the incident from her mind. But even as she attempted to focus on her book, the guilt gnawed at her, refusing to let go. It was nearly 10 p.m. when the second knock came. This time, it was louder, more insistent. The sound echoed through the house, sending a jolt of adrenaline coursing through Susan's veins. She froze, her pulse quickening. He was back. For a moment, she considered not answering. She could ignore it, pretend she wasn't home, and maybe he would go away. But the knocking continued, harder now. Her mind raced with possibilities. What if he was angry that she hadn't helped him earlier? What if he was trying to force his way in? She imagined him standing on the porch, his hands still in his pockets, hiding something dangerous. Without thinking, Susan grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice came through the line. There's a man outside my house, Susan whispered, her voice shaking. He was here earlier, asking for help, but I think he's come back. Is he trying to enter your home? No, Susan said quickly, but he keeps knocking. I don't feel safe. The operator asked for her address and reassured her that officers were on the way. Stay inside and don't open the door, she instructed. Susan nodded even though the operator couldn't see her. Her hands trembled as she set the phone down. She backed away from the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Minutes felt like hours as she waited, her ears straining for the sound of sirens. She imagined all sorts of scenarios, each one worse than the last. Maybe he was waiting for her to open the door so he could push his way in. Or maybe he was angry, ready to confront her for not helping him earlier. Finally, the flashing lights of a police car appeared in the distance, and Susan felt a wave of relief wash over her. She watched from the window as two officers stepped out of the car and approached her house. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, scanning the area. One of the officers knocked on the door, and Susan hurried to open it. She felt a small sense of security now that they were there. Ma'am, are you all right? One of the officers asked, his voice calm but serious. Yes, Susan said, her voice shaky. He was here earlier, asking to use my phone. I didn't open the door. I told him I couldn't help, but now he's come back. The officers exchanged glances. We'll take a look around, one of them said, his tone firm. Can you describe the man? Susan nodded. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and I think he was black. The officer jotted down her description. Stay inside, he said. We'll let you know if we find anything. Susan watched as the officers moved down the driveway, their flashlights sweeping through the shadows. She felt safer with them nearby, but her mind was still racing. Had she done the right thing, or had she overreacted? It wasn't long before one of the officers returned to her door. He knocked gently, and Susan opened it cautiously. Ma'am, he said, his expression somber. We found a man matching your description a few blocks away. He's hurt. Looks like he was in some kind of accident. A hit and run, maybe. We've called an ambulance for him. Susan's stomach dropped. What? He said he's been trying to find help, but no one would answer their doors, the officer explained. He's not dangerous. He's a victim. Susan felt a wave of nausea. She had called the police on him, on a man who had needed her help, a man who had been injured, possibly disoriented, and desperate for someone to assist him. And she had turned him away. He's being taken to the hospital, the officer added. Looks like he's been wandering around for hours. Susan stood in the doorway, unable to speak. The guilt was overwhelming, pressing down on her chest like a weight. She had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume the worst. And now the man who had needed her the most had suffered because of her fear. The flashing lights of the ambulance faded into the distance as they took the man away. Susan closed the door, her hands trembling. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty street, wondering how she could have been so wrong. The house felt unbearably silent after the police and ambulance left. Susan sat down heavily on the couch, her hands shaking. The weight of what had just happened bore down on her with an intensity she hadn't expected. The man had been hurt, not dangerous. He had come to her door because he needed help, and she had refused him, driven by a fear she hadn't even questioned. She thought about the look in his eyes when she had told him she couldn't help, the disappointment, the desperation. And now he was in the hospital, possibly because of the accident that had left him stranded in her neighborhood. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about how easily things could have been different. If she had just opened the door, if she had just trusted him enough to offer her phone or call for help, he might not have had to wander the streets for hours. He might not have had to endure the pain and fear of being ignored and turned away by people who saw him as a threat. Susan's thoughts spiraled as she imagined what the man must have gone through. She pictured him walking in the dark, knocking on doors, hoping someone would show him kindness, only to be met with suspicion and rejection. She wondered how many other doors had stayed closed, how many other people had made the same assumptions she had. Her phone buzzed, and she looked down to see a text from Claire, her neighbor. Claire had probably seen the police lights and wanted to know what had happened. Susan couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she say? That she had called the police on an injured man because she had been too afraid to help him? That she had let her fear of the unknown, her fear of someone who didn't look like her, cloud her judgment? The guilt gnawed at her, relentless. She tried to justify her actions, telling herself that she had only been trying to protect herself, that the world was dangerous and she had to be cautious. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been driven by fear, yes, but also by something darker, by the assumptions and biases that she had absorbed over the years, without ever questioning them. And she thought about the news she had been watching earlier, about the stories of racial tensions and protests. She thought about how easy it had been for her to see those events as distant, as something that didn't affect her personally. But now, in the silence of her home, she realized that those stories, those tensions, were part of her world too. They had shaped the way she saw the man at her door, the way she had reacted without even giving him a chance. Susan wiped away the tears that had started to fall. She felt sick to her stomach. The guilt was overwhelming, but it was also mixed with something else. Shame. Shame for the assumptions she had made. Shame for the way she had let fear control her actions. She stood up, pacing the living room, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside her. She wanted to do something, to make it right, but she didn't know how. The man was gone now, taken to the hospital, and she didn't even know his name. She didn't know how badly he had been hurt or if he would be okay. She didn't know if he would even want to hear from her if she tried to apologize. The thought of facing him, of admitting what she had done, terrified her. But she knew she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't just move on from this without acknowledging the harm she had caused, even if it had been unintentional. Susan sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she picked up her phone. She typed out a message to her daughter, explaining what had happened, trying to make sense of it all. She hoped that Emma would understand, that she wouldn't judge her too harshly. But as she stared at the screen, her finger hovering over the send button, she realized that it wasn't Emma's judgment she was afraid of. It was her own. She had always thought of herself as a good person, as someone who cared about others, who would help someone in need, but tonight had shown her a side of herself she wasn't proud of, a side that was quick to judge, quick to assume the worst about someone based on nothing more than their appearance. The message remained unsent as Susan set her phone down. She couldn't find the words to explain what had happened, not yet. She needed time to process, to understand why she had reacted the way she did, and how she could change. For now, all she could do was sit with the guilt, the shame, and the painful realization that she had failed someone who had needed her. And that failure would haunt her for a long time to come. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. For more gripping stories that challenge perspectives and make you think, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content, and we appreciate every single one of you for being part of this journey. Thanks again, and see you in the next one.